Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another joint Royal Asiatic Society and Islamic Art Circle at Thrace book launch. We're most grateful to Alison for having invited us to participate in this, and this is for a very highly relevant and very exciting looking new tome entitled The First Capital of the Ottoman Empire, the Religious, Architectural and Social History of Bursa, written by Dr. Suna Çagaptay, who is an architectural historian working on the cultural interaction between Christianity and Islam and its reflection on the built environment in medieval Anatolia. Currently, she is postdoctoral research associate at St. Edmund's College and the Faculty of Classics, working for the impact of the Ancient City project, which is funded by the European Research Council at the University of Cambridge. And she's on research leave from her position in the Faculty of Architecture and Design at Pasha University in Istanbul. Suna will give us a description of her book, and then this whole session will be moderated by Dr. Elizabeth Foden, who is a senior researcher in this ERC-funded project in the Faculty of Classics at Cambridge, and of which Suna, as I just said, is also a member. Elizabeth's publications include The Barbarian Plains, St. Sergius between Rome and Iran, Shrines and Banners, Paleo-Muslims and Their Material Inheritance, The Lamp and the Wine Flask, Early Muslim Interest in Christian Monasticism, and as preparation for her current monograph that she's working on, the Parthenon Mosque, King Solomon and the Greek Sages. So there'll be, what we'll have is, Suna will talk now and give her presentation, and then Elizabeth will ask questions. And then at the end, there's a chance for all of you to, for a few minutes, ask questions as well. So please put any questions that come to mind as the evening progresses. Please just write them into the chat room, and then Alison will moderate those questions at the end. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and look forward to hearing what Suna has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. Let me share my PowerPoint first.
What's it to both go? My God, they just don't listen. It's
okay. I think you can see my screen, and you can also hear me fine. I'm hoping. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm delighted to be part of this series that are sponsored by the Royal Asiatic Society. I especially thank Alison Ohta for her kind invitation. I also would like to thank Rosalind and Professor Scott Redford for inviting me, for encouraging me to get in touch with the Royal Asiatic Society to organize such an event. So I'll begin with my slides, but before anything else, I would like to begin with a map. So in the aftermath of the Battle of Kösada in 1243, Mongol Ilkhanids began to replace the Rum Seljuk state, and they started to rule in much of Anatolia. And the situation on the ground was a little more fluid than the narrative that I'm telling you right now. We start seeing the clusters of Byzantines, Armenians, Mongol Ilkhanids, Rum Seljuks, and Muslim principalities holding on power in different areas of Anatolia. And more or less within a matter of century, we start getting a map like this, the map that you see now on your screen. And the Ottomans, a cultural group that is originating from the Central Asia, they came and they settled down in the northwestern part of Anatolia, which is also known as Bithynia. And they conquered the city of Bursa in 1326, where they established their first capital city. This is the period, the 14th century in Anatolia, is a period that's often identified as a black hole. One Ottoman historian by the name of Colin Imber has called this period as the black hole because of the lack of written accounts, contemporary written accounts. And in this book, I try to do something else. Instead of using or looking for textual sources, I try to use buildings and landscapes as my cultural artifacts in order to examine how the Ottomans made the city of Bursa, which is a Byzantine city, their Bursa. So the book itself deals with the first 100 years of the Ottomans, and when they conquered the city of Bursa in 1326 after a 10-year siege, and how they began mixing in with the local populace and created a new urban setting to come up with a cultural identity, both for themselves and also for the world around them. Chronologically, my book situates Bursa between two important dates. The first date is the late 2nd century BC, when the city was founded by the Hellenistic ruler by the name of Prousias I, hence the name of the city, Prousa. And the second date is 1402, when it was sacked by another lame ruler. Prousias I had this nickname. He was called Lame or Holos. And the end date for my book is 1402, when it was sacked by another lame ruler, as I just mentioned, Timur or Tamerlane. And I'm hoping that my talk today won't be as lame as I chronicle the urban transformation of the Byzantine Prousa into Ottoman Bursa. What I did in the book is, besides the introduction, I have 6 chapters. In the first one, I chronicle the historical framework during the rise of the Ottomans and Bursa as an Ottoman city. And then in the second chapter, I looked at the city in transition. I looked at the patterns of continuity, conversion, and reuse, how the Ottomans reused Byzantine and classical buildings, and for what purpose. In the third chapter, I looked at the convent masjids as well as the Friday mosques, but I mainly focused on the construction practices for those buildings. I, again, examined the construction practices, how we can identify a hybrid architectural practice and the role of the Masons in the creation of that hybrid workshop practices. And those hybrid workshop practices were not only Byzantine, deriving from the local practices within the region, but also we were able to see several elements coming in from the other regions of Byzantium, such as the Dalmatian coast or Italy. And the Ottomans were also interested in getting inspirations or hiring builders coming from Syria as well. So we also start seeing Mamluk interaction or Mamluk details appearing in the workshop practices. In the fourth chapter, I looked at the inverted T plan, not only offering a typological analysis of this plan, which is the most common building plan that we see in this city in this period. I also decided to move beyond our perception of this plan and confining it only to Mongol Ilkhanate practices. I decided to look at the comparative evidence coming from other Islamic dynasties and linking this form in a way to the audience halls or the Mejlis halls that we see in the Abbasids and the Tulunids, Fatimids and the Mamluks. And then in the fifth chapter, I looked at the memory and the monuments, in which I examined the kulliyas that are established by each sultan and how they interact with one another, and what kind of a landscape project that we witness in Bursa. And then in the final chapter, I looked at the idea of invisible Bursa or Prousa. There's a problem with the way that my screen is showing the slides. I'm worried that you're not able to see some of the slides in their full length or Okay. So the book's thematic organization owes much to the scholarship by D.D. Fairchild Ruggles, who has examined the meaning of the constructed landscape as it transitioned from one culture to another in the context of Hispano-Umayyads. So I follow her triad, claiming, legitimizing, and inhabiting in my work as well. But to her triad, I add a fourth dimension, the expansion of the city into suburban areas and the control of the land. And if you look at the Google Earth map over here, let me also turn on my laser pointer. You see that the city is sandwiched in between the Mount Olympus, the mountains in the back, and the plain, and the urban axis is very much confined to this area in between the two. And again, the historic city is located right here, for which you have a zoomed in detail right here. And then if we go from left to right, we have the complex that's done by Murat I. This is the westernmost extent of the city. And then the complex by Murat II, the old city, the new city established by Orhan, over here, number 5, the Grand Mosque by Beyazıt I right here. And then we have Yeşil complex built by Mehmet I, and then Yıldırım built by Beyazıt I. And then just to add up to the different dynamics in terms of the commerce and commercial life and the overlapping identities, I added a bridge over here, number 9, Urgandia, and also I added a shrine into the discussion. So today I'll be presenting some sections from chapters 1, 2, and 5, and I'll be especially focusing on the idea of Ottomanization of the city, and I'll be discussing, this was a twofold project. In the first stage, the architectural conversions took place mainly at the sites of former Byzantine use. And then the Ottomans transformed the existing urban order by adding new structures and reviving elements of the ancient Greek, Roman, and Byzantine layers. By moving outside the old city as early as the 1340s, and then in those new neighborhoods, they in a way mimic the spatial visual model of the old city, which you see right here. So in other words, as I'm going to argue today, Bursa's reinventors Ottomanized the past as they built their capital city into a metropolis. Okay. So here we are, in order to look at this Ottomanization, let's carry on with the drawing of the old city. And today I'll be mainly talking about those 4 buildings: Mausoleum of Osman and Orhan, the palace quarters that's located within the old city. And also I'll be looking at the First Friday Mosque, which I like to identify in between the two, two of the tombs that are reused by the Ottomans. And then if you look at the city, the old city is surrounded by the city walls that are originally built in the Hellenistic period. On the south side, there is the 2 lines of walls, and then the city had 5 city gates. And today when I focus on the Ottomanization process, when I discuss the reuse practices that are done by the Ottomans, I won't be focusing on only focusing on the religious conversions. I'll be also looking at the non-confessional or secular buildings conversions as well. And in that regard, we should remember that the Ottomans not only converted the churches into mosques and mausolea, but also they converted the bathhouses, city gates, and city walls and palaces as well. So, let's try to focus on the rise of the Ottomans in the city of Bursa. And when it comes to the rise of the Ottomans in the city of Bursa and in general as a culture, we often are reminded by this quotation. And here I'm gonna read it to you. A moon arose from the holy man's breast and came to sink in Osman Ghazi's breast. A tree then sprouted from his navel and its shade compassed the world. When Osman awoke, he went and told the story to the sheikh, who said, "Osman, my son, congratulations for the imperial office on you and your descendants." In this dream, which we are told by Aşık Paşazade, a 15th century Ottoman historian, Osman, the eponymous founder of the Ottomans, has a dream in which he sees a tree sprouting from his navel, becomes fully grown, symbolizing the stamina of his successors and the domains that they would conquer. With this dream, Osman took on the mantle of responsibility for leading his people. This dream became a myth. It probably was always one. But the rise to power of the Ottomans several decades later required more than myth or the intervention of a divine hand. It actually necessitated the conquest of people as well as the cities. And where Osman's dream may deceive us in its suggestion of a mythic people arising from a void, an equally problematic situation confronts us when we extend the discussion to architecture. With each conquest, for example, Bursa in 1326, Nicaea in 1331, and Nicomedia in 1337, as well as many others, the Ottomans began converting their urban realms to suit their needs. In his pioneering study that's published in 1929, Christianity and Islam under the Sultans, Hazlitt used the term architectural transference to describe how the idea of sanctity continued from the Byzantine to the Ottoman periods, demonstrated by the conversion of Byzantine buildings into mosque and mausolea for the founders of the Ottoman state in Bursa. And some scholars looking at these patterns of conversion and recycling or spoliation of the Byzantine buildings, they claim that the Ottomans were basically doing a triumphalist appropriation based on a perceived common Islamic practice. And one such example that we often come across is the Danishmentname, an epic narrative of conquest written in 1265 and rewritten in 1360. This work describes Hilfat Gazi as son of Christian converts, demolished a church built by his grandfather and transformed this building into a madrasa in Amasya. The architectural and political conversion in this period seemed to be going hand in hand. The Ottoman chronicle, known as Düsturname, written by Enveri in the mid-15th century, refers to the Aydıned ruler of Birgi, a contemporaneous principality based in Izmir and Ephesus. And accordingly, Mehmet Bey converts many churches into mosques. This account also compiles the deeds of the heroic Aydıned ruler and the raider Umur Bey, who died in 1348, as well as other authors and popular epic legends, and shows how the Ghazis in Anatolia succeeded due to their commitment to the Holy War against the infidels, as well as their cooperation with them, achieving a political superiority over their rivals. And in a way, all those accounts reveal important details about dismantling and reusing buildings and incorporating them into the evolving design in the Islamic cultures of medieval Anatolia. Indeed, architectural conversions were about more than just convenience or appropriation, and I think their place within the Bursa context or Bursa's broader landscape must be understood. So in order to identify this conversion and its other associated meanings, let's go to the city of Bursa. You are looking at the aerial view of the city, and Bursa is one of the cities that's heavily demolished by human interventions and natural events, including fires and earthquakes. And the most destructive earthquake taking place in 1855, it pretty much complicated the task of piecing together Bursa's early Ottoman past. In the aftermath of the 1855 earthquake, several restorations took place, and the city visible today are almost as much the result of Ahmet Vefik's patronage, the governor when the remodeling in the 19th century took place in the city, as of the reign of Osman Murat I or Beyazıt I. And if you remember the standard Ottoman practice of converting the city's main church into a mosque, giving that building the name Ulu Cami or the Holy Mosque or the Grand Mosque, we now, within the context of this image, I suggest that we should look for a Friday mosque within the old city. And indeed, in the archaeological and physical context, we have the evidence of that conversion. In the other cities in Bithynia, like in Nicaea, in Iznik, we have the Church of Saint Sophia turning into Hagia Sophia, as well as in Biga, the cathedral in the city became the Orhan Mosque. But when we look at this aerial photo of the old city, what we see is those two domes, and these are the tombs of the founders of the Ottoman state, Osman and Orhan. And the only monumental mosque that we see within the old city is the mosque that's built after the death of Murad I and known as the Martyrdom Mosque in 1389. So we don't have any physical evidence standing for the Friday Mosque of Orhan, the Sultan who conquered the city. So where we might locate this building or what kind of an appearance that the building had. And of course, in the case of Bursa, because of all those remodelings and restorations, the buildings that we see or the buildings that I identified in the aerial photo are the ones that are all rebuilt in the 19th century. And they are rebuilt in such a way that no original details remained visible, just like the tombs that you see over here with the tomb of Osman and the tomb of Orhan right here. So in order to look for what was there before the earthquake, before 1855, I went into the archives to look for the visual evidence or the travelers' accounts that are talking about the pre-earthquake state of the city. For example, this is the one by Löwenjam, in which you see the city walls, and behind it you see a strange looking building, not exactly looking like an Islamic building, but a high domed church complex with cross domed plan. And then at the corner, you see a turret and a domical structure. And behind it, you see the mosque that I just pointed out in the aerial view, the one by Murad I, Shahadet Jami. So these are the only buildings that we are able to identify. And again, our question of where the Friday Mosque of Orhan was located remains unanswered. But, you know, in a way, all those earthquakes, travelers' accounts, fires, human interventions, they all make it difficult for us to produce an image of the city. And this creation of the image of the city for us is almost both an addition and a subtraction. And in a way, unexpected elements can appear in unexpected places. So like, for example, this one, the image is done by Johann von Erla in 1725 in a book that's entitled The Project for a History of Architecture. Von Erla was a leading Baroque architect of his period. And in his album of history of the buildings, he publishes several Ottoman buildings. And one of the buildings that he draws is the, at the top, it's labeled Camiül Orhan Padişah. And on the bottom in French and in German, he says that this is the Grand Mosque of Orhan II in the old city of Bursa in Asia Minor. For us, perhaps it's easy to get that, you know, there was no Orhan II ruled as a sultan in the Ottoman dynasty, but Camiül Orhan Padişah is something that makes us to think more in order to identify whether we would label this building as the first Friday mosque in the city of Bursa. Almost all travelers that I used in my book have visited Bursa, but we cannot say the same thing about von Erla, who had never traveled outside Europe. So where did von Erla get this idea of depicting this building? I'm not sure, but I have a theory that he might be able to read several travelers who visited the city and the depictions of the city as well. And but the fact that this is this drawing is found in an album of drawings, including 6 Ottoman mosques, is something. It's almost like a hint. It's giving us a hint that he was trying to create a genealogy of the Ottoman architecture in this period. But I'm going to come back to that later. The fact that he uses, he comes up with this design, a round building topped with a dome with 2 minarets on either side. And several other travelers complement this visual depiction by von Erlach. For example, Ibn Battuta talks about Orhan's Masjid containing the tomb of Orhan, and the fact that it was a Byzantine church later converted into a mosque. Evliya Çelebi again talks about the mosque in the old city and the tombs that are located within the mosque as well. And then sometime before the earthquake, Charles Bernard talks about this is the oldest mosque in the city, located within the citadel. Next to it, there are the tombs. And then Andreas Mortman, around the time of just after the earthquake, he talks about the damage that's created, that he saw at the tombs, that the reconstruction is impossible. So this takes us to another kind of thinking about von Erlach and how he got this idea. At first glance, I think we may suggest that he was shuffling some details. Perhaps he had read about Bursa to come up with a transitional building. And if we again look deeper into the design that he made for the Karlskirche in Vienna in 1725, I find it quite similar. The building in Bursa, his depiction of the First Friday Mosque in Bursa and his church, that they are very similar in outlook. And in a way, it just reminds us of the late Renaissance, early Baroque urban setting, urban fabric in Rome as well. The curious image of the Bursa Mosque is, I must add that it was one of the 6 Ottoman mosques, including Hagia Sophia, Süleymaniye, Sultan Ahmet. And there was one other building that we see next to the First Friday Mosque that in von Erlach's album, and that's the Mosque of Jakovalı Hassan Pasha in Pech in Hungary, that's dated to the late 16th century. And if you compare the present day photo, which is taken from the backside with the frontal depiction of the building, you might be able to say that the details are very accurate. What perhaps he was trying to do is to create a timeline of the Ottoman architecture and the genealogy of the buildings that are coming from the Orient, because the Ottoman buildings were found in the same album where he depicted the buildings from Assyria, from Mesopotamia, and so on. But still, even with the depiction of von Erlach, we cannot conclude whether the old, the Friday Mosque in the old city looked anything like the image that von Erlach had depicted. But there is an epigraphic evidence that complements this depiction, and this epigraphic evidence is known as the 1337 inscription, and it's extensively studied by several scholars, starting with Paul Wittek. And later, in more recent years, it's been studied in detail by Heath Lowry and Hüseyin Yilmaz. What we see over here in the inscription, it talks about a masjid that's built by Orhan, and it also gives the titular embellishments for Orhan as the exalted great emir, warrior on behalf of God, Sultan of the Ghazis, Ghazi, son of the Ghazi, champion of the state and religion and of the horizons, hero of the age. So all those embellishments for Wittek was a way to claim the Ghazi identity of the Ottomans and how this identity, this notion was deeply rooted in the idea of jihad. But more recently, a discussion that's done by Hüseyin Yılmaz, he harks back this tradition of using those embellishments to the Abbasid as well as the Rum Seljuk practices. And he says that we also see those titles in the coinage as well. So for Yılmaz, this is a way to Orhan's attempt to legitimize himself as the rightful heir to the pre-Ottoman Islamic past in Anatolia. And given this, the 1337 inscription combined with the 14th century Ottoman architectural interventions, it helps us to identify more of an ethos than an ideology, wherein a conquest was inevitable, but it was moderated by a dialogue with Bursa's past and present, its urban fabric and inhabitants. The idea that we had the First Friday Mosque situated in the old city with a round structure topped with a dome surrounded by 2 minarets on either side was also supported by 2 other travelers, John Covell and Thomas Smith. John Covell, for example, in this depiction, in the sketch that you see on the left-hand side, right-hand side, you see a church, cross-domed plan over here, and then a baptistry or structure appended to it. And he claims that this is a sketch of the mausolea and perhaps Orhan's Friday Mosque. He talks about the tombs, the location of the tombs, in the round structure over here and the cross-domed area, and people praying in between the two. And another traveler, Swedish traveler, Löwenhjelm, provides us with a similar depiction in 1825, showing us the round structure in the forefront and the domed structure at the back, giving almost like a complementary evidence to the sketch that's done by Covell. One more traveler's depiction, Catenacci, 1835, again, standing for giving us the evidence that those buildings were conjoined, the dome structure of Orhan's tomb and Osman's tomb over here. When we compare the baptistry where Osman was buried, there are several comparisons that are dated to the late antique baptistries as well as temples of the late Roman period, and I'm showing you several examples. And the same, within the same complex, there was a mausoleum of Orhan, and Carl Löwenhjelm depicted this in 1825, where you can see the cross-domed church topped with a high domed dome. Several other travelers visited Bursa, like Louis-Francois Cassa in 1786, where we look at the complex from the east facade. We see the apsidials or the side apses that we also note in Covell's sketch. Again, the building is topped with a high domed dome. Next to it, you see the minaret of the Shahadat Mosque. The only original detail that we see in the building is the opus sectile floors that you see over here. And there are 4 different patches. There's a smaller fragment right here, and there's another one right there. And this is something that I would like to compare it to this, the opus sectile floor from the Church of Saint Sophia that's done in the 13th century in Nicaea. Overall, the architectural style that we see in the tomb of Orhan in the main church is comparable to the examples coming from the Byzantine architecture dating from the 10th to the 14th century. And here I'm showing you several examples again. The details that we see in the traveler's accounts, especially in Covell's sketches, like the basket capitals that we associate to the 6th century, you see a depiction over here, or the synthronon that we only see in the early Byzantine buildings, that is situated within the main apse, the seats for the clergy to sit down during the Mass. These are the details that shows us that the building went through several modifications even in the Byzantine period. And again, if you look at the plan of the building, it looks like it started its life as a basilica, and then it was turned into a cross-dome church. The baptistry went out of use in the later periods. So in a way, we can conclude that the complex that we see in Bursa, the baptistry housing the tomb of Osman and the main church housing the tomb of Orhan, might have been the same part of might have functioned as the tomb as well as perhaps the first Friday mosque in the city of Bursa. And if we again follow the travelers' accounts, they usually identify the building, the Christian attribution of the building, as the Church of St. John Prodromos. Just to demystify what I was examining or finding in the travelers' accounts, I decided to do a field work in 2009, a GPR survey, just to see whether we would be able to find anything buried under the ground. Remember all the destructive earthquakes as well as the fires that demolished or obliterated much of the city. So what I did was the ground penetrating radar survey that covered much of the northern tip of the city, including the area of the mausolea, the palace right here, and then the extended gardens over here. And I got a permit from the ministries of Turkish Ministries of Culture and Defense. And the method itself uses radar pulses to image the subsurface or buried remains under the ground. And the fieldwork was done with the help of several institutions, and I must thank them again, including the Turkish Cultural Foundation, the Barakat Foundation, as well as the Dumbarton Oaks Byzantine Studies Research Center. So you're looking at several photos of this. And for example, in the tomb of Orhan, we were able to identify an apsidal curved wall on the eastern end of the building, which the lines of which you see right here. And then the profiles are showing up over here. And then in the park area, just to the north of the tombs, we collected several other profiles during which we were able to collect the remains of perhaps a chapel starting from 1.2, going all the way down to 1.8 meters, giving a measurement of 11.5 to 8.5 meters, something around that size. And recently the Bursa municipality decided to conduct some salvage excavations 500 meters east of the tombs, and during which they excavated a basilica, perhaps dating to the 6th century. So again, this is a sign that this area is filled with pre-Ottoman layers. One of the things that the Ottomans converted in the city, in the old city, was the area of the palace. And again, in the Slovenian depiction, the tip that you see over here with the turret and or tower and the round structure with the dome is the one that we can identify as the palace. And again, in this vignette, you see the depiction of the zoomed in detail of the palace done by Lovenian. Both of those are done by Lovenian. This palace or kiosk, tower kiosk idea was something that we started seeing in the late Byzantine period as well as in the Seljuks, for which I have several comparative slides. For example, here you're looking at the Konya pavilion done by Kılıç Arslan II. And then here, Lovenian's detail can be especially compared to the Kovel's depiction of the Edirne citadel in the city of Ephesus or Ayasuluk, where you see the rising of the tower kiosk and the mosque behind the city walls. And here is a current photo of the palace in Ayasuluk. The GPR also revealed several really good sealed buildings in the military area, which today roughly sits on the remains of the Ottoman palace, as well as the Byzantine palatial complex. And we were able to find several of those remains buried under the ground. And also we were able to find part of the tower that was part of the inner protective walls of the citadel. So as early as the reign of Orhan, that pretty much intervened with the urban fabric in the old city of Bursa, we see that the Ottomanization went beyond the limits of the old city, and then it just moved beyond the old city and extended towards the east of the old city. So this is the old city again. This is the quarters that are established by Orhan. So in a way, Orhan had two different Bursas in the city of Bursa, the old Bursa and his new Bursa. And then the second Sultan who followed Orhan was Murat I, and he chose the western side of the city, which is not covered by this panorama of the city that's done in the 1958, but he decided to go to the western part of the city and build his complex. And then the next Sultan, Yildirim or Beyazıt I, he decided to build his complex on another prominent location within the city over here. And in a way, both with Orhan, Murat I and Beyazıt I, we see that the architectural and spatial references or the siting of their new complexes, which are known as the Külliyes, and they included socio-religious buildings, including convent masjids, soup kitchens, madrasas, and so on. Those complexes, or the siting of those complexes, point more toward the aspirations of classical cities, as I have argued in my book. They were perched on hilltops. Both the complex by Murat I and Beyazıt I offered panoramic views overlooking the city and the plains. And in a way, each Sultan decided to create their own version of Prousa's Acropolis, which is located right here with its siting and urban framework. So this was Orhan's lower city. You see his convent masjid over here and the frontal view of the same complex right here. And much of the complex is totally destroyed because of the earthquakes and fires. Only a convent masjid as well as some parts of the commercial quarters survive. But the area was revived again during the reign of Beyazıt I when he added his Friday Mosque in the new part of the city, or the lower city. In the aftermath of his victory at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. He also added a commercial quarter just to revive the commercial activities in this part of the city. What we had with Murat, he asserted his power by constructing the Martyrdom Mosque in the old city. And then he also decided to move the center of the city to the west by constructing his Külliye, where the hot springs were plentiful. So in a way, he was instrumental in creating or continuing the spa city identity that we see in Bursa. And his choice of the site helped him to maintain his district's previous context intended to make use of the abundant water resources. And here you're looking at a 19th century photo of the convent masjid and the Külliye complex of Murat I. This is a frontal view of the convent masjid. And the major bathing complexes that he decided to reuse, and he decided to make them as part of his vakıf, are located over here, and they are known as the Eski Kaplıca, or the Old Bath. And this complex is mentioned in the 2nd century AD as well as in the 3rd century AD. And it had the title of the Royal Bath. And in a way, its identity, its glory was dimmed by the construction of the construction of the bath complex in Pythia in Yalova by Justinian in the 6th century. And most of the travelers who visited the city, they talk about the hot springs and bathhouses. We note the letter exchanges that are done between the governor of the city, Pliny, as well as the Emperor Trajan, and also the local political figure by the name of Dio. They all talk about the emergence of water resources and abundance of the water resources in the city. And in the Byzantine accounts, we note that in the 8th, 9th, as well as the 10th centuries, several Byzantine emperors visited the bathhouses on their way to visiting the monks and monasteries on Mount Olympus. The core of the Eski Kaplıca is alternating brick and stone, one of the major characteristics, building characteristics of the period. And the dome might be original. The corbel table is worthy of mentioning over here, again, following upon the late Byzantine wall construction techniques. And when we look at the interior of the building, especially with the columns and the column capitals, these are all Byzantine architectural details adorning the octagonal hot and cold rooms. And the baths, they changed dramatically over time, but during the reign of Murat I and Beyazıt I, they were given new sections. They had new sections added. And when you look at the plan of those buildings, both the Eski Kaplıca and the one that I'm going to show shortly, they all show a modest size. They are asymmetrical as opposed to the larger thermae of the Imperial Roman period. And this is the Kükürtlü bath. This is also located to the western part of the city, where the complex of Murat I is located. And this is one of the complexes, again, remodeled by Murat I and later on by Beyazıt I. And in the traveler's account, we note that this was the bathhouse, the Kükürtlü, or the sulfur baths, were the ones that are frequented by the Greeks in the city, because they often associate the sacred spring over here with Saint Patricios, the Bishop of Bursa, who was martyred being thrown into a pool of boiling water in a bathhouse that was located near the temples dedicated to Hygieia and Asclepios. So the Christian community uses this bath complex, and the Muslims in the city use the old bath. In a way, the baths then represent an element of functional as well as non-confessional continuity with the Byzantine past, whether they were restored and replaced. Following Murat I, his son and his successor, Beyazıt I as well, followed this two-tiered strategy for expanding and controlling the land. So in the lower city, he constructed his Friday Mosque, but for his Külliye complex, he chose the eastern side of the city, where his complex was built right here. And when he decided to construct this complex in 1390, 1395, he chose the Küşleri Bahçe, or Küşleri Gardens, listed in Orhan's Vakfiye as the site of his Külliye. And he also ordered the construction of a water infrastructure to transport water from Mount Olympus, as well as including 5 different creeks and rivers originating in the old city to his wife's Vakfia. So he was also very much interested in reusing the water resources. So in sum, as I discussed today, the siting of the complexes by Orhan, Murat I and Beyazıt I exploited the landscape in a way that recalls the siting strategies of classical and late antique cities. Being perched on hilltops, both the Murat I and Beyazıt I complexes offered panoramic views overlooking the city and the plains. In a way, each of them created a version of Prousa's Acropolis with its siting and urban framework. Both the symbolic and practical conversion of confessional and non-confessional buildings demonstrate how religious and political power was made visible in Bursa. The existing classical and Byzantine architectural forms appropriated for practical purposes, but they were also employed as symbols of conquest and to demonstrate the continuity of earlier beliefs and traditions within the new Ottoman context. What was significant about the reuse of the Byzantine buildings is not that they were adopted, but the way they were culturally redefined and put to use. Within the narrative of conversion and the transposition of buildings from one cultural setting to another, we see that the Ottomans accommodated the Bursa's visual legacy by preserving local forms with historical reference. And using archaeology as well as visual and written sources by travelers, as I have argued today, as well as in my book, I believe that it helps us to paint a richer and more accurate narrative of the city and its Ottoman inhabitation that started in the early 14th century, making clear that the contributions of the past do not threaten the authenticity of the present. Thank you so much for listening. Now I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Suna. That was absolutely fascinating. I just wonder, have we got Elizabeth?
Yes.
Yes. Right. I'm going to hand over to you.
Right. Yes, thank you, Suna. Don't know quite where to begin. So I think I'm going to begin with the word empathy, because what you didn't get from Suna's incredibly rich overview of only a fraction of what she knows and tells us about Bursa in her remarkable book. I've spent the past 4 years working very closely with Suna, and what really comes out very, very clearly, and I think it's incredibly important for all of us in this room, I wish I could say, is how we are scholars and we are human beings. And Suna has managed in this story of a city to bring together not only very detailed scholarship that reaches across, breaks down disciplinary borders. She works, and I'll come back to this, I mean, she works not only as an archaeologist, architectural historian with technologies that I certainly couldn't use. She looks at early modern literature, early modern representation, her Byzantine sources, her Ottoman sources. I mean, it's very, very diverse. It's very, very didactic, but everything Suna does is incredibly subtle and nuanced, and you're not hit over the head by anything that she's doing, but her work is, this book, I'm hoping very much, will become a paradigm for students and other scholars about how we work with all the materials we possibly can to approach the very difficult problem of change, how to notice, perceive, how to squeeze from all of our sources change in a city, because we don't even realize it ourselves, of course, in our daily activities. So how do we use sources from so long ago, and the whole range of sources that she commands. So scholarship and empathy. I know empathy, I like to think of it in this, the creative imagination where the Bakhtin talked about it. It's something that we must bring these two together. And I commend this book for doing exactly that, and in a very readable way. I know I don't have too much time, but I don't think I can stress this enough, because we all know that in the age of publishing, a lot gets published that probably shouldn't have been published. This is not one of those books. This book took a long time maturing patiently also to be produced. Her supervisor is, I think, listening. And so it's a real example of how we should be patient and diligent, and we should also be soft. And obviously there's a lot of hard work that's gone into this, but it's knitted together in a way that is so subtle that's the word I kept coming back to. And it's quite interesting because I learned a lot that I didn't know. As I said, Suna and I are both on this research project, and I know that quite a few of you may have, I think some of you in this meeting were at our Istanbul conference, other conferences we've had. Nonetheless, I was surprised. I was surprised a lot. And that's very exciting to see that books like this make these big collaborative grants that we're all now in the business of scrambling for, of getting, if we're fortunate. We're very fortunate that Andrew Wallace Hadrill, who you probably know, some of you, by his work in Pompeii. Of course, he's done a lot of BBC work as well, television. He had the vision of bringing together people of a wide disciplinary background to talk about their expertise and listen to each other. And when I read this book, I thought this book is actually a model of how these rather widespread, maybe thinly stretched, you might say, projects can pay off, because slowly we're listening to each other. And I could see the fingerprints of so many of our members in this book. And so to me, I'm somewhat skeptical sometimes about collaborations, but I was very heartened by seeing a book that is very much the work of a single scholar mastering material, but at the same time listening very hard to other people. And there's where I want to mention her introduction, actually the preface as well, because it, again, to me was a model of how we approach historical scholarship, because by looking at the history of the study of Bursa, what Suna did is that she also was looking at our own approaches to those questions. So at the same time, she was really writing intellectual history, while she was telling us about how people had looked at the city in the past. And again, not it done in a very flexible, creative way that I highly recommend to everyone who teaches to show this to your students as a way of making history scholarship not only political, but making it clear that how we think about cities is always political. And it's always difficult because things are always changing and things are always being pushed into what Suna calls the invisible realm, the invisible, those things that are gradually forgotten in cities, that you can tell by a funny bend in a road, but that people may have forgotten. And anyway, do recommend your students this book for that very reason, also because it's very interdisciplinary. It shows how it can be done. One last thing about the book, I don't know, I hope that you're all writing your questions for Suna down, but I want to say something about the format of the book, which interests me a lot, because the text is not, it's a bit over 100 pages. And it's one of these rather irritating, I thought, books with endnotes. So you have to click on you keep switching back and forth if you have the electronic version to the notes. But after I got used to that, I realized that it really works as a book which is lively, well told, engaging, very engaging, and full of people. Suna's presentation actually was full of buildings, and it's quite interesting. You would, when you go and get the book with the reduction that she's given you, you will see that actually the book is full of choices. It's full of people, whether they're the people who are living in the cities, whether the rulers or the next rulers. They're all making choices, and you see them doing that. But go back to the format, we get this very engaging story of the difficulties in scholarship and in the difficulties of living in a space, of the pleasures of the hot water. And Suna came to the baths at the end. And I hope there'll be some questions about the baths and the natural environment. But it's as if you have two books, because when you go to the notes, they're not distracting, but they're rich. They're like a book of their own. So you have this sense of the apparatus, it's there. And there are even a few jokes, which I love. It's very important that we have a bit of levity in our notes as well. But it's very interesting as a book how the two elements work together. So that is what I wanted to say about the actual book. Do I have a little more time?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I may.
Yes.
Okay. I've got my view in a really strange place. I just see a black. Anyway, maybe I could. Can I look at gallery? Oh, I see some faces too. Good. So audience, book is pattern, and this incredible range of the sources. There are two other things I want to talk about. One is very brief, but I think it's incredibly important because I think it's where, at least in the fields that I'm aware of, from classics to medieval, the Eastern Mediterranean and up to Central Asia, we're all very concerned with ecology, landscape. And Suna's book, again, it engages in a way you could only briefly mention in your overview of all these buildings. What's really exciting about Bursa is that it's green and that it's water. I mean, Evliya says it's marvelous. In everything's an element in Evliya Çelebi. He says Bursa is water, and this is marvelous. And it was known as the Green City. I would like to know, and this is one of the questions maybe you can come back to. I'd really like to know whether it's still today a green city, in the sense, are they promoting in an ecological identity? Because I know that you're very, because you're so interconnected as a scholar, but as a human being, you're very aware, you know a lot of people in the municipality. So I was, by reading about, Pliny's letters and reading about this fundamental water and green attraction of Bursa, that everyone felt, even but everyone who went through was astonished by the green, lush, the fruit trees. How is this municipality today? How is the city today showing itself? Not only how is it thinking of itself, but how is it showing itself as an eco-city? So that's because I know you're very interested in heritage. That was a question that definitely arose in my mind when I was reading about cities, because you care about cities now. And again, that's a great strength of the book. If I have just 2 more minutes. One of the things we think about a lot in our project, the impact of the ancient city, where we go up to the very contemporary, is this question of this sort of shift of perspective between the contemporary city dweller who sees from the inside how they think of their city for themselves, and the outsider who's looking in, and that outsider includes us as scholars. And this book is extraordinary because it is very aware. Suna is very aware of her position as a scholar looking in from the outside, but she's also on the inside. And I think that's another thing that makes the book quite remarkable and very important methodologically for us to see how can we have this sort of Blickwechsel? How can we switch back and forth? But we can do that, and that brings about this question that we ask: how does this city see itself, and how do others see it? And there is this really difficult question that of appropriation. That Suna, again, it's something we talk about all the time, appropriation. It's what we have to talk about, but it's something, and this gives me goosebumps because it's something that is so important today. I mean, tomorrow there are going to be meetings on the Hora, what's happening right now on the Athenian Acropolis. It's very controversial. People often want a single version of their city. Which single version? Which period are we looking from? And so that's where it's very important to us that we have someone like Suna who's actually involved in Bursa with the municipality. And so I'll leave you, I have several other questions I will ask if other people aren't immediately leaping up with questions. But I have this question about how water is exploited in the heritage identity, the heritage industry of Bursa itself. But I have two questions, one of which I want to ask you now, and that is, if you could, in the light of what you care about of Bursa, if you could excavate, if you could do an excavation of Bursa, what would that be? Where and why? I mean, what is it that would add? And when you read the book, all of you, you'll see how subtle is the discussion that Suna makes between the different periods of history, the Byzantine and the Ottoman in particular, this interchange. But still, there are times when we come up against a very hard chronological line. So is there an excavation you would like to do that would help us to understand where those lines can be drawn? Or are you always going to insist on a hybrid or a fuzzy line? Because if any of you who read this will see, hybrid is one of the favorite words. So that's my question. If you were to have your dream excavation, where would it be? What would it be and why? I think that was enough for me. So thank you very much, Suna.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your kind words. And it's always nice to hear friends and colleagues' opinion or about the book, how they read the book, what they can make out of the book. So I'm grateful for your comments and also the points that you raised. I'm going to start with the last question, and then probably I'll just try to say more about how green the Bursa is, the water situation, stuff like that. If I were to excavate, I would say, if I were given a permit, I would definitely go and excavate around the area of the tombs. But I know that this is not a very realistic one because the monuments, the tombs, are considered to be almost sacred. They have a status of national monument. Today, when you go and visit the tombs, you see the people who are going in, covering their hair and praying in the tombs of Orhan and Osman because they are the ancestral founders of the Ottomans. So it would be very difficult to do anything inside the tombs, but in terms of what we were able to find outside the tomb within the park, I would love to do test trenches there, for example. The other thing, the other areas that I'd like to excavate within the city would be the area that is very close to the complex of Murat I, the area of Çekirge, the western part of the city. I think that part of the city was also very much living in the Roman period and also in the Byzantine period. If we read the Roman accounts talking about the workshops, bathhouses in that area, I think, there were neighborhoods there. And I would be very curious to find out what was going on in and around the bathhouses there, for example.
So can I just ask then, say with your first response around the tombs,
Yeah.
thinking in terms of how to explain the layers that draw a wider public. I mean, you explain the interconnections during different periods so well in your book. How would you then explain, how would you want to explain the prehistory, what was behind, underneath and around the tombs? Obviously, depending on what you find, you've already have some sense of what you think is there.
I usually like to play it safe. I use the word Byzantine very little, like very few times. I often use the word Ottoman, and how they reused the pre-existing fabric. That's how I usually approach when I talk about what I want to do in terms of the archaeological expeditions in the city. In the minds of the people at the municipality, what they are curious about is this early Ottoman period, but they have a different understanding of the early Ottoman period. They glorify it too much. They also have a way of looking at it in a very neo-Ottoman way as well. They have their own way of understanding how glorious the early Ottoman sultans were. They had this really big palace, big Friday mosques. They changed the city, like they created Bursa from scratch, like, there was nothing there when they came, things like that. So anything pre-Ottoman is not very much present in their minds. So I usually I use the term Ottoman as like an umbrella term.
We need a Turkish translation. I hope you're working on that.
Well,
other questions, Alison?
Yes, there is a question. Well, a few, and this is one I wanted to ask as well. Do you see the transformation of Bursa into an Ottoman capital as setting the pattern for the later conversions of Edirne and Constantinople?
There is, we can make a lot of comparisons between how Bursa was transformed and how Constantinople was turned into an Ottoman capital. I cannot really see Edirne fitting too much into the picture. And there is also a hierarchy that's created for each Ottoman capital city. In the Vakfia charters, Bursa, in the Vakfias of Beyazıt I, as well as Mehmet I, the city is seen as Darul Mulk, the city of the sultans, and Edirne in the other Vakfias is seen as the frontier city or the frontier capital. So there is this distinction. But in the way that the different sites were chosen in Bursa and different or the siting of the complexes in Constantinople or Istanbul under the Ottomans, we can make several comparisons. How, again, in Istanbul and in Bursa, they use the old city, but very soon after they moved beyond the old city and they established new neighborhoods. In the case of Edirne, it's not that apparent. There is the reuse within the city. There is also the immediate reuse just outside the city. So it's almost like contemporaneous. In both Istanbul and Bursa, they first focus on the old city and then they move beyond the old city afterwards.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question as well. For example, the development of the Kulliya, is this something that begins at Bursa?
In Tabriz and Sultaniye, in the Ilhanid monuments or complexes, we can talk about a similar approach to the idea of creating a social religious complexes. But I think the Ottoman example seems to be a unique one because each complex is very much centered around those convent masjids. They are not Friday mosques. They are unlike the Ilhanid examples. And then those convent masjids were surrounded by buildings of public or social functions. So yes, I mean, what the Ottomans were creating is something unique in that regard. And the way that they chose those sites to be functioning as the location for the social religious complexes is also very unique, because they identify really prominent locations within the city.
And we have another question here. Did you find any evidence of water-driven mills that existed or persisted in Bursa? I suppose we're into the Ottoman period. I think that's what he means, and perhaps repurposed for endowments.
In the old city, when we were doing the GPR, we found in the raw data, we found water channels, waterworks, things like that. I'm not sure whether they would function as water mills. I have no idea. But in the other, there are like several locations within the city to the eastern part of the city where Yıldırım's complex is located. There's a big waterfall fountain. And the people who live in the city, the people who work for the municipality, they claim that it's an Ottoman monument. I saw it only on the photos. I don't think it's an Ottoman monument. Probably it's, and it's next to it, there's like a Roman villa remains with mosaic floors and cascading river or water paths, stuff like that. I think this would be anything but Ottoman. So things like that, they are everywhere within the city, but they need some sort of a field work.
And then we've got another one. Do you have anything to say about the relationship of Bursa and Yenişehir? In other words, the urban relationship of the old and the new?
Well, I mean, for Yenişehir, the name says it all. It's a new city. If you follow the accounts, again, they talk about a palace that's built by Murat I. And I think we can sort of link this with the idea of Ottoman Sultan on the move always. Not just the palace in Bursa, but they built other palaces or garden palaces within Bithynia to help them, you know, to move from one city to another as they were going along with their conquests. And then there's also the big convent in Yenişehir that was built in the middle of the 14th century. And architecturally speaking, it just follows, or it just shows very similar techniques that we see in the buildings in Bursa, alternating brick and stone. Even the Byzantine heart, I know Bob is here, Bob's favorite, the Byzantine heart on the facade, something that we see in the late Byzantine buildings. Yeah, it was a convent that was built for a dervish. It held multiple purposes or functions, including the distribution of food, lodging, and so on. But yeah, Yenişehir, I would say it wasn't very significant. Probably it had a very small garden palace or mobile palace for Murat the First.
Well, you have lots of comments thanking you and saying what a wonderful talk it was, and I absolutely agree with them. I was going to just ask you one very quick question. You mentioned the Waqfiyas. I mean, how useful were they to you in your work?
They were useful in the sense that the choice of the words that they used for the complexes. For example, for Yıldırım's complex, it gives you a very lengthy description of what the holdings are, land holdings are. And I think it's very valuable. And we often do not pay enough attention to, the fact that, originally the location of the Külliye was occupied or was part of Orhan's Vakfiye, and it included big gardens. So Yıldırım comes over, or Beyazıt I comes over and decides to take that land as a location for his complex, and he decides to donate some other land somewhere outside Bursa for Orhan's Vakfıya. So you see all those like shopping around, negotiations. And also I found it very interesting, again, with the reign of Yildirim, when he decides to build an aqueduct so that his complex gets enough water to maintain the daily needs. And he also decides to give 5 different springs that are originating in the old city to his wife. It's I found it like it would be a very good gift to give over to your wife. If you're a sultan, you just say, here are my springs to you. So
Lovely.
yeah. I find them very, very useful. The interchanging names of like imaret, masjid, using the expressions like, the house of the sultans or the house of the rulers, and itemizing, which villages were part of which vakfıya, which sultan, what was coming in, what was being produced, who were going in and buying the stuff from them, like Genoese, Venetian, commercemen, things like that. I think overall they are very valuable as a source.
Right. Well, I think we're going to finish there, and I have to thank you very much, and Elizabeth, for really pulling all this together. And it really is a very good book. I have read it and enjoyed it very much. I learned a lot about Bursa, which I didn't know at all. So I would recommend that everyone buys it if they can, and it's on at a very good discount at the moment. So I think we're going to let Suna have a bit of a rest, because she's been talking for quite a long time. And everyone, you will see that the chat messages. Suna, thanks for a wonderful talk. Look forward to reading the book. And everyone really, I think, enjoyed this and the dialogue as well between you and Elizabeth. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. And hope to see you on our next book launch. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.